right. So let's open with a word of prayer before we go to the Word tonight. Lord, we pray that your Holy Spirit will guide us, interpret for us, lead us, give us wisdom and understanding of your Word. We know that it's a spiritual Word, and we know that it can only be understood spiritually, and that's part of why you give us your Holy Spirit. So we pray that you open it to us and give us a deeper and broader meaning of the Scripture that you gave us, and that particularly in the Torah that you literally dictated to Moses. So we pray these things tonight in Christ's name. Amen. Okay. Now, again, we will, what is this? Part 6, I believe, in this effort to understand the spiritual realm. And tonight, I'm going to start in a familiar place, but I think that you might well agree with me at the end of looking at this verse that we don't pay enough attention to it. We've all read it a zillion times, but I want you to notice literally what it says. And this is an excellent example, I think, of so often how we overlook what is literally said in a verse, and therefore we're not understanding the entire meaning of what the verse is. So we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 3. And you all know the story, but I think we kind of know it more from the movie, you know, as Moses, as Charlton Heston, you know, goes up onto the mountain and et cetera, and it's kind of more our version of it. So let's read 1 through 6. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, who was the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. It's the same mountain, okay? Now, where are they now? In terms of today's countries, where are they?
Saudi Arabia.
Yes, northwestern Saudi Arabia. Okay. So, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord said that he turned aside to look, God saw that he turned aside to look. God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Don't come near, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. And he said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now, I want you to notice the following things about what we just read. Okay? First of all, in verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the midst of the burning bush. So where is the angel of the Lord residing? In the fire. And yet, obviously, the angel of the Lord is distinct from the fire. Otherwise, how would he recognize who the angel of the Lord is? So the angel of the Lord appears in the midst of this fire that doesn't consume the bush. Right? But when Moses turns away, which is verse 3, then in the Hebrew, Elohim calls to him, noticing that Moses turned away, which is stated again in verse 4. So the question is, who is the angel of the Lord, and thus, who is Yahweh in this passage? And why are they both present?
So Yahweh, God Father, angel of the Lord, Jesus.
Okay. We'll see if you're right. Okay? But you understand, and it comes clear, even more clear in the Hebrew, there's two persons that in this, not one. Okay? Did you notice that before? No. It's interesting, isn't it?
Slow down.
Okay? Now, turn, since I have you all the way to the left side of the Bible, now I got to turn you all the way to the right side of the Bible, so turn to the book of Acts. We're going to go back to this history by Stephen that he gives, this talk, this history of Israel. So we're going to chapter 7 of Acts, and we're going to go starting in verse 30. Okay. Let me get there. Now here's Stephen recounting the history, okay? And after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai, in the flame of a burning thorn bush. And when Moses saw it, he began to marvel at the sight, and he approached to look more closely. There came the voice of Yahweh. Notice, not the voice of the angel, the voice of Yahweh. Okay, you see two distinct persons here. All right? And he says, I am the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, father of God, Isaac, God of Jacob. And Moses shook with fear and would not venture to look. But Yahweh said to him, take off the sandals from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and I have heard their groans, and I have come down to deliver them. Come now, and I will send you to Egypt. Then Moses, whom they had disowned, sang, in other words, they said of him in Egypt, okay, who made you a ruler and a judge, okay, is the one who God sent to be both a ruler and a deliverer with the help of the angel who appeared to him in the thorn bush. So, who is going to travel along with Moses and Israel out of Egypt? The angel of the Lord. Okay? He's the one that's going to do the actual leading. So, we see here this voice of Yahweh, and, you know, as I said, the angel of the Lord is the one that leads them. Now, I want you to turn, since I turned you all the way to the right, I want to turn you all the way back to the left now.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Why, if Yahweh reveals himself there, why angel of the Lord has to be there too?
Because I think what you're going to see is they have different roles.
Yeah.
Okay? They have different roles. You'll keep this in mind as we go on. So go to Exodus 23. Exodus chapter 23. And we're going to look starting at verse 20 of Exodus 23.
Exodus 23?
23, starting verse 20. Now I want you to see another aspect of this whole story and what it leads to, them coming out of Egypt and coming to Sinai. And I want you to see another thing that we often don't pay attention to. All right? Starting in 20. And behold, I'm going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place in which I have prepared. Verse 21. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious toward him, For he will not pardon your transgressions, since my name is in him. But if you will truly obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversary. Now, could this have been a normal conventional angel?
No.
Why?
Capital.
Well, it's capital. She's depending on the translators here, okay? What is your argument in the text that this could not have been the average Malik?
Because
Maliki.
my name is in him.
That's one. And there's a second reason.
And he's a guard.
He's more than
Be with them.
he's more than just a messenger.
Yeah.
Why?
Because he's going to
He has
protect them.
ability to
Well,
forgive sin.
There. Very good.
What? Ability to forgive sin.
He has the ability, it says, for he will not pardon your transgressions. Only God can forgive sins.
Right.
Therefore, the angel here must be also God. Okay? Isn't it interesting? Exactly. The or the person that we call Christ, the person that we call the Son. All right. Now, turn next to Deuteronomy chapter 4. I won't make you travel as far this time, to the right. Deuteronomy chapter 4. We're going to be spending a little time here tonight in Deuteronomy, actually.
The people were obstinate. They needed a strong leader.
They did. And they were disorganized, and they were pagan, and they had very little knowledge of the Lord left after a couple hundred years in slavery, in a very, very...
400 years.
Well, we don't know. They were there 400 years, but we don't know that they were enslaved for all 400 years. But still, they were an extremely satanic culture for 400 years, okay? So, we're going to start in verse 35 here of Deuteronomy 4. Okay? To you it has been shown that you might know that the Lord, He is God. There is no other besides Him. Out of the heavens He let you hear His voice to discipline you. And on earth He let you see His great fire. And you heard His words from the midst of that fire. That would be the fire on top of Mount Sinai. Okay? Verse 37. Because He loved your fathers, therefore He chose their descendants after them. And He personally brought you from Egypt by His great power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you into and to give you their land for an inheritance as it is today. Verse 39. Know therefore today, and take it to your heart, that the Lord, He is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. So therefore, where does God reside?
Everywhere.
Exactly. On heaven above and earth below. Where does the angel Lord most often show Himself?
On the earth.
On the earth. Where the Father most often shows Himself or presents Himself as being in heaven. It's not exclusively true, but it's frequently true.
There's not too many incidents where God the Father has showed Himself.
True. And there are probably no incidents in which He showed Himself completely.
And that also is with the Holy Spirit.
Now, it's true. Now, I want you to turn from Deuteronomy over to your right, past Joshua, to the book of Judges. And I want you to see one more thing in this area. Notice the title that I made to this section. I guess I was in my, somehow in a mood of King James English at this point. From whence doth the Trinity cometh? Okay? You'll have to excuse my...
What is this language?
It's kind of like King James version of the Bible.
Yeah.
You know, the Old English. The Old English.
Old English.
Yes. Okay. Now, So turn to Judges chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 1 through 4. Now remember, they have this is the end of the conquest. You know, Joshua's passed away. They're in the land, but real quickly they're not doing so well. All the things they were told to do and told that they were supposed to avoid, they start to do them all. Okay. So, starting verse 1. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt. Pretty clear who the angel of the Lord is, isn't it? Okay. And led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land, which of course they consistently did. Okay, you shall tear down their altars, which of course they didn't. You have not obeyed me. What is this that you've done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become as thorns to your sides, and their gods, that would be, translate the lesser Elohim, shall be a snare to you. And it came about that when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept. They realized they were in trouble. And if you read the book of Judges, you realize they're constantly in trouble because they're constantly being harassed by all of these groups that they didn't get rid of like they were supposed to. So, in the New Testament, we regularly see mention of the Father who is spoken of typically in heaven, and the Son who visits the earth. Of course, both of them are God, just as the angel of the Lord and Yahweh are God. Now,
Question,
yes,
why then he's called the angel of God, the angel of the Lord?
because he is a messenger of Yahweh to the people, and he is a leader of the people in what they do. And since he's a messenger, he's called angel or Malik.
But
That's his word.
meaning
That's his role.
Christ,
Remember, Malik is a role.
meaning Christ.
Yes.
Okay. So was it hidden for purpose?
That's what I want to go into next. All right.
But when Christ came in the New Testament, he also followed the will of his Father.
Correct. And we're going to look at some of those verses right now, okay? Now, prior to Jesus coming to the earth and being born as the Son of Man, you would have to say that the relationship between the Heavenly Father and the Son seemed much more vague. Remember the verses we just read? If you were a Jew and reading Exodus 3 like we just read, how do you think you'd understand the difference between the angel of the Lord in the burning bush and the Lord speaking to Moses, obviously not from the burning bush? How would you understand it?
Come again?
If you were a Jew,
Okay.
okay, now you have to understand, we have the advantage of knowing Christ,
Right.
knowing his ministry, knowing the difference between the Father and the Son, but this was not that clear for the Jews. Okay? Therefore, when they read a place like Exodus 3, it must have been very difficult for them to make the distinction between the angel of the Lord and Yahweh.
Right.
It must have been like, it just wasn't as clear. It had not been made as clear yet. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, I mentioned here a very famous quote from one of my favorite Bible teachers, Dr. Chuck Missler. And I think it's a great quote. You have to think about it a little carefully, but the quote is, the Old Testament and the New Testament is revealed, and the New Testament in the Old Testament is concealed. Okay? I think it's a great line by him. Okay? What is vague in the Old Testament becomes more clear and is revealed in the New Testament. All right? But it's all still contained in the Old Testament.
So this Jews back then, they thought about this angel of the Lord as of this angel.
They might have thought of it just as an angel. You know, I didn't pull and look at what all the different rabbis said, although we could probably look at that literature. But I think we have to say that it was not that clear. Now, I want you to look at 3 different verses in the New Testament. Let's start with Luke 10. We could pick a lot, but I'm just going to give you 3 because I think they kind of summarize a lot of Jesus' talk in this. Luke 10:22. Now again, who's Jesus talking to? Not the church. The church doesn't exist yet, right? He's talking to the Jews. And he says, all things have been handed over to me by the Father. And no one knows who the Son is except the Father, and who the Father is except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him. And again, there's many verses like this. I'm picking just 3. But if you think about what he's saying, he's trying to explain to the Jews that there's a Father and a Son. Because it's not that clear to them because of the Old Testament passages. So he's taking, and particularly in Matthew, he quotes Old Testament after Old Testament verse to try to show them this is what it means. Okay, here's the relationship between the Father and the Son. Let's go to a second one. Let's go to John 10. You know, sometimes when we read Jesus' words, we think of his teaching in these areas, and we kind of like think of the Jews like as dum-dums, you know, like what was their problem? But, you know, we have the advantage of being post him born and post, you know, all these things that he did on earth. We have the knowledge of that. Well, they didn't have that advantage. So they're kind of working more in the dark here.
Well, they didn't have the New Testament, right?
Correct. So we're going to John 10, verse 30 first. He says this statement, I and the Father are one. So whether it's the angel of Yahweh or Yahweh, they are still both Elohim. Right? But that was kind of a radical idea to teach the Jews because they thought of God as being only one. Okay?
Well, they didn't want to see Christ as the Messiah.
No.
No.
But they also did not understand because they kept repeating, okay, you know, God is one, God is holy, God is one. So therefore, to try and understand that there was a second person of the Trinity and then a third person of the Trinity. Yes, Jack.
Well, part of that was what they condemned him for because he said, my Father, and so it's Father God. And
Yes.
And they felt that he was claiming to be God.
Exactly.
He was.
He was, but to them, that was absolute blasphemy because God is one to them.
Probably yet another reason why they rejected him.
Absolutely.
Messiah.
Now, at which moment of history Jews actually started to realize that Messiah is coming?
Well,
He never had.
part of them in the early church did after Jesus' resurrection. Because remember, the early church, the first...
But before Jesus came, they even didn't know the Messiah is coming?
They had verses through Isaiah and the prophets, but they were very poorly understood.
They didn't acknowledge him as the
No. It was a very vague, shadowy thing for them, hard for them to understand.
So after Jesus' first coming, they start to expect Messiah's first coming. Right? So they didn't realize that he already came.
They're still waiting for the first one.
Yes, the Jews that never
Yeah.
accepted him. For instance, those in the Jerusalem church understood,
Right.
but those that never accepted him in the first century,
That's what I mean.
they, like Robin said, they're still looking for the Messiah to come because they didn't understand that he came in the person of Jesus Christ.
There are today what they call Messianic Jews that
Of course.
who do accept it.
Yeah, because they're Christians.
Very far.
Yeah. Now also look,
That's a big one that Jonathan Kahn never believed. He's a Jew that
yeah,
didn't believe that. And
right. Until he understood it. Now,
Even at his death, so, they thought that this man was a blasphemer.
yes,
God.
they did.
that's why they killed him.
That is true. Now let's go to also drop down in John 10 to verse 38 also. But if I do, he's talking about these works of my Father. And he says, even though I do the works of my Father, you don't believe me, verse 37. But if I do them, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. Now, that makes perfect sense to us, but to them, this is a very difficult thing to understand at best, and as you said, also seemed like blasphemy. How can you call God more than one? All right? So, last one is John 14, another example. John 14, verse 10. It says, Do you not believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works. That must have been quite difficult for them. They must have thought, what is this guy talking about?
I thought about that before, that he had to explain all that.
Oh, yes. That's why I only picked out 3 or 4 verses, but he constantly is trying to explain this to them, because from their Old Testament perspective, it wasn't clear. All right? Okay. So, we see here that Jesus needed to explain this because the shadow of all this is in the Old Testament, but it's not clarified until Christ himself comes as the second person and explains it both through his life and through his explanations. Now, next thing, number 2 in our outline, I'm calling it Yahweh, the Lesser Elohim, and Mount Sinai. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I want to get to the third part here. And I want to spend more time on it. But I want you to see something, again, that we tend to overlook. Now, turn to Psalm 68. Psalm chapter 68. And we are going to start in verse 15 of Psalm 68. He says, a mountain of God is the mountain of Bashan. Now, Bashan is what would be today the eastern side of Syria and maybe the extreme western part of Jordan. Okay? That would be Bashan. I'm going to show you, well, here. We have the map up. Now I'm going to try to, for those that are listening to this, on the no, this is fine. For those that are listening on the YouTube, I'll try to see if I can get a map up on this, but here's Bashan, okay, in this area here. You see where Damascus is here? All right. So it's on the very eastern side. This whole area is called the Transjordan area. And it starts down here in the lower part in Moab. Then, of course, there's this region of Ammon. And then finally, there's this area of Bashan up here. This is during the time right before the conquest. So he says, a mountain of many peaks and the mountain of is the mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with envy, O mountain with many peaks, at the mountain which God has desired for his own abode? Now, which mountain would that be? Which mountain did God desire for his own abode? Not yet.
Sinai?
Yes, Mount Sinai. You're going to see why in a second. And he says, surely the Lord will dwell there forever. The chariots of God are myriads and thousands upon thousands. Who do you suppose that is?
Angels.
Yes. The lower Elohim, the lesser Elohim. Okay? Are thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them as at Sinai in holiness. So when Yahweh's in Sinai, who's with him? The angels. Okay? And then verse 18, thou hast ascended on high, thou hast led captives thy captives, thou hast received gifts among men, which is a very interesting thing because it's a quote from it's quoted in Ephesians 4, verse 8 in the New Testament. It has a very particular meaning there. I'm not going to go into that right now, but so we see here Mount Bashan is very possibly a reference to current day Mount Hermon. Now, what do we know about Mount Hermon that we especially learn in the book of Enoch, First Enoch?
Well, it's a portal.
Yes.
For where
Yes.
they come and go.
It's the highest mountain in the whole area by far, and this is where it's alleged that these 200 fallen Elohim come and make it onto the earth that create the Genesis 6 debacle. All right? That's Mount Hermon. And we're going to come back to this later on in a few minutes. So, they're accompanied by these lesser Elohim, the chariots of Yahweh. Now I want you to turn from here back to Deuteronomy 33. I want you to see another reference in this area. So go back just past the beginning of Joshua, the 33rd chapter of Deuteronomy, and we're going to read verses 1 through 4. Now this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the sons of Israel before his death. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. Seir refers to Mount Seir, which is down here. Oh, where's Edom? Well, Edom is, I don't think it's marked clearly on this map right here, but it's also in the Transjordan area too.
Yeah.
Okay? Now,
South.
yes, it's south a little bit. All right? And he says, he shone forth from Mount Paran, and Paran, interestingly enough, is relatively close to Mount Sinai in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones, i.e., in Hebrew, Elohim. At his right hand there was flashing and lightning for them. Indeed, he loves the people. All thy holy ones are in thy hand, and they followed in thy steps. He's now referring holy ones there, not to the angels, but to the Jews that were following or camped around Sinai. Okay? Everyone, now notice the next phrase after he says, and they followed in thy steps, in God's steps. Everyone receives of thy words. Verse 4, Moses charged us with a law, a possession for the assembly of Jacob. So what happens, of course, from Mount Sinai?
10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments are given. All right? The law is given. And who's there with God, Yahweh, on the mountain?
Moses.
And the angels. The Elohim, the chariots of God are there with him. Right? Now,
So why they were with him that time?
well, I'll see if I can make this more clear just in a second. So, now I want you to turn to two New Testament passages, because you could say, well, this is just the Old Testament. Well, it's reiterated in the New Testament. So first, go back to Stephen again in Acts 7. In his history of the Jews. In Acts 7. And we're going to go to the end of his talk. And we're going to look at verses 52 and 53. Look what he says. Which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. He's making himself extremely popular here in this talk to the Jews, okay? All right. Verse 33. You who received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you did not keep it.
Okay.
So angels were also part of the mediators that communicated the law of God to the people.
So are you saying they were angels were serving as a transmitter?
I think so. And again, there's not just the 10 Commandments given during this time. There's 613 total commandments given during this time, during the 10 months or so that they're around Sinai. But now, to show you how this further is in the New Testament, go to Hebrews chapter 2. Remember, the writer of Hebrews is writing
Okay, may I clarify something? I'm sorry.
to the Hebrews. Okay? In other words, he's explaining to the Jews things in the Old Testament from a New Testament fulfillment standpoint. Yes?
Your turn.
Okay. All right, if it comes up, keep it in mind. So, Hebrews 2, verses 1, 2, and 3. Now, look at this argument that the writer gives. For this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Now, what has been heard? He's just got done in the first chapter talking over and over again. Well, he's talking about angels, and he's quoting the Old Testament practically at least every other verse in chapter 1.
A
Now,
whole bunch of from different places.
yes, from different places. He's pulling it together to explain to these Jews that he's writing to how all this information in the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New Testament. Verse 2, for if the word spoken through angels proved unalterable, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? So, the angels were part of transmitting the law to the people on Mount Sinai. We often don't think about that, do we?
Are you
Yeah.
talking about at the foot of Mount Sinai?
I'm talking about on the top of Mount Sinai. That's where they undoubtedly were with the Lord.
We just read. that.
Right. With Moses.
With Moses, when he went up there. But he wasn't always up there.
Did you say that, okay, I remember now. Did you say something about 600 commandments?
613. If you count all the commandments that are given all the way through Exodus during that time period, where God keeps giving all these laws and regulations and ordinances, you'll total them to 613. Okay? And they have a lot of different purposes.
Throws another one in there.
Now, we've read and studied about the divine council. We know that it's numbered as 70 Elohim. Why? Because it's stated that it's the same number as the nations of the earth that God started with. Remember, God appointed in Genesis 10 70 nations. He divided the earth into 70 nations. And the council, the Elohim, took that number, 70 of them, those lesser Elohim.
It just throws me that God needed a divine council.
Yes. But you see, here's the interesting thing. God, though He doesn't need it, He created these beings to share with, to communicate with, and to make decisions with. Remember back weeks ago we talked about how I think it was in 1 Kings, where they were talking about what to do about the problem of Ahaz. And so the divine council meets, and some of the lesser Elohim say this, and some of them say this, and one of them speaks up and says, I know what to do. Do you remember that? You know, God's letting them speak their mind. They're free will beings.
Does
Okay?
that look like democracy
Well, not exactly.
in a way?
It looks like a king that has his realm and has his subjects, you know. So let me go on. So we know this.
But yet Ann made a very good point, because God, then we know now that God is not like a, you know, I'm alone and I'm good with it, you know.
Correct.
Some of the churches should follow that example.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, maybe they should have more of a cooperative decision making among.
The communication that He wanted someone around. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
Really.
It is.
He wouldn't have created humans if He didn't want someone around.
Now, and here's the thing, it's even more interesting. Psalms tell us, I think it's Psalm 8 tells us, that man was created, quote, a little lower than the angels. But what is going to eventually happen one day when we get our new, correct oiketerion?
Well, we'll be higher than that.
Because we'll be, according to Paul, judging the fallen angels
Right.
at the end of the age.
And as humans, we can make decisions to choose and for salvation.
Yes.
Once their decision is made, there's no turning back.
Once the fallen ones made it, there was no turning back. Absolutely. Now, turn back, to kind of complete this thought, turn back to Exodus 24. There's this very interesting event that occurs on Mount Sinai. I would have loved to have a video of this one. Okay? I mean, there's some events that I'd say, Lord, can I have a video of that? This is one of them I really would have liked to have a video of. Exodus 24, starting verse 9. Then Moses went up with Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel. Think about that. 70 of the elders of Israel. And they saw God. They saw Yahweh, the Yahweh of Israel. And under His feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. So they saw Him in a very glorified state, like He actually exists.
Almost like a movie that He came down.
Yeah. Verse 11. Yet He did not stretch out His hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. In other words, even though they saw His holy glory, He did not attack them because they were sinful. Okay? He did not do that. That's what is being said. He did not stretch out His hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. And they beheld Yahweh, and they ate, and they drank. Now that one's really interesting. Okay?
God must have provided the food.
Absolutely. Verse 12. Now the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain, and remain there. Literally, they're already on the mountain. Come up higher, okay, is what he's really saying.
Is he separating Moses from the rest?
Yes. Okay, come up here with me, higher on the mountain, and remain there. And I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction. How was those 2 stone tablets written?
By the finger.
By the finger of Yahweh.
The same like with Daniel?
Yes, the finger of Yahweh. All right, very good. You put that together. So, we see here that just like the divine council was 70 originally and was with Moses on the top of Sinai, God has 70 elders of Israel come up with him onto Sinai, and the heavenly council and the earthly council actually are together in the same place at this point. And I think it points out that what begins as Yahweh's design in heaven ends up being mirrored on the earth. And we see that pattern over and over again. Now, here's the part I'd really like to spend a little bit more time on tonight. I entitle it, Back to the Giant Problems.
Oh, you love this part.
Now,
Your favorite.
you're not going to be able to indict me from spending too much time on the giants, because I'm going to show you why the Bible spends a tremendous amount of time on them. Okay? This is, again, when I go through this tonight, it's going to be another argument for why not understanding Genesis 6 correctly is a fantastically terrible mistake. You're going to see how important it is, all right, in this story, in this account. So, let's summarize a little bit first. Israel was reborn as a nation coming out of Egypt. They're released from Egypt. God reveals himself to them on Mount Sinai. He gives them 613 codes or laws that do various things. They regulate their behavior. He teaches them principles about his holy character. He sets up a sacrificial worship system. He sets up the tabernacle and the elements of it. And he finally directs them to the edge of the land of Canaan, where he will fulfill his promise to Abraham. Remember? That's why this promise is so important. Then the problems begin. Because what happens? He sends out 12 spies, and what, as they go and reconnoiter the land, what do they see? They see giants living in the land. So they come back together to give a report. And of course, Joshua and Caleb say, yeah, there is plenty of giants there. But God said we're going to get the land. So God says we're going to let the land, let's go. The 10, though, say, you don't know how big these guys are.
Yeah.
We look like grasshoppers in their sight. They're huge. There's no way. We can't do this. And so the 10 basically convince Israel to disobey the Lord, and that causes them 40 years of wandering while that generation dies off, right? Then God, after 40 years of circulating around Saudi Arabia for 40 years, brings them back, takes them to the northern edge of Saudi Arabia, and starts to march them up into the Transjordan area. But he does something that I think is really very interesting. And that is, and I'll point this out on the map, they come up down here, of course, far enough down is the northern part of Saudi Arabia, and they start to come up all through this area, and they come up here, and notice what happens. Where are they going to end up entering the land eventually?
Near Jericho.
Jericho, right here.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not where they go. God marches them all the way around here up to here.
Yeah.
Right?
That's
Now, interesting.
a loop.
It's kind of a loop. It is. Now, let's look at some of these verses and try to understand this. Let's first turn to Deuteronomy chapter 2. Deuteronomy has a lot of interesting information about this event that we're going to read about when they're just about ready to do the conquest of the land. Deuteronomy chapter 2. And we're going to read starting in verse 8. And I'm going to read a section here because there's several things in it that you need to understand. So try to follow. So we pass beyond our brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Arabah road, away from Eloth, and from Ezion-Geber, and we turned and passed through by the way of the wilderness of Moab. See, they're down there now. Then the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession. Isn't it interesting? And you're going to see why in a minute. Because I have given Ar, one of the areas, towns, to the sons of Lot as a possession. So he promised the nephew of Abraham this area. And so God says when the Jews are marching back up to the land, he says, you're not allowed to take that area. That was promised to the descendants of Lot. So
Wasn't, didn't one of the daughters have a son named Moab?
Yes, correct. Verse 10. Now, here's where you have to pay attention. The Emim lived there formerly, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they were also regarded as part of the Raphaim, but the Moabites called them the Amim. Now, who's he talking about now? Giants. He's talking about these different offshoots of these Raphaim. The kind of the whole group of them together are called the Raphaim. But there's different elements of them. Okay, they may be even somewhat different sizes. Some of them are called the Emim, and you're going to see later on there's another couple groups of them we're going to read about here in a minute too. But where did these giants live? Down in Moab. But the descendants of Lot, his ancestors, eventually rid themselves of them. That's what we're being told now. Okay? Now, verse 12, and the Horites formerly lived in Seir, but the sons of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. Now arise and cross over the brook of Zered yourselves. He's talking now to Moses and to Israel. And he says, so we crossed the brook of Zered. Verse 14. Now the time that it took for us to come to Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the brook of Zered was 38 years, until all the generation of the men of war perished from within the camp as the Lord had sworn to them. In other words, we'd been here before, and because we disobeyed, it cost us 38 plus years. Now we're back to where we started. Okay? Verse 15, moreover, the hand of the Lord was against them to destroy them from within the camp until they all perished. In other words, every one of that generation was going to die. It was virtually 40 years of constant funerals. That's literally what it must have been like. Verse 16, so it came about when all the men of war had finally perished from among the people that the Lord spoke to me, saying, you shall cross over Ar, the border of Moab today. And when you come opposite the sons of Ammon, now they're coming up into this area. This is Ammon. Should be around this area here. Okay? Maybe, I don't know. No, it's not on that one. There it is. It's a little bit further to the east of Moab. There's Ammon. Just wasn't on that map, okay? So now they're going even a little bit north and to the east more. And he says, and when you come opposite the sons of Ammon, do not harass them or provoke them. For I will not give you any of the land of the sons of Ammon for a possession. Why? Because I have given it to the sons of Lot as a possession. Again, it was promised to Lot's descendants. And God said, I'm not going back on my word. That's not your land. Right? Verse 20. It is also regarded as the land of the Raphaim. Ammon is too. For the Raphaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites called them the Zamzummim. Who are they? Giants. Another tribe of giants called the Zamzummim. There are. Again, verse 21, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before them, and they dispossessed them, and they settled in their place. Just as he did for the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites from before them, and they dispossessed them and settled their place even to this day. And the Avim, who lived in the villages as far as Gaza, another tribe of giants. Okay, the Gaza now is to the western Mediterranean coast. Okay, over there. He says, and the Caphatortim, who came from Caphtor, which I believe is that one of Crete. I have to check that. Okay, all right, and destroyed them and lived in their place. Verse 24, now arise, set out, and pass through the valley of Arnon. Look, I have given Sihon the Amorite, the king of Heshbon, and his land into your hand. Begin to take possession and contend with them in battle. So the first time he says, now it's time to start war, is when they get up into here. Okay? That's the first time. Now, we're going to see who they meet up there. Verse 25. This day I'll begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under the heavens, who, when they hear the report of you, shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. So notice verse 26 now. So I sent messengers, who's speaking?
God.
Moses is speaking. Okay. So I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, with words of peace, saying, let me pass through your land. I will travel only on the highway, and I will not turn aside to the right or to the left. You will sell me food for money so that I may eat, and give me water for money so that I may drink. Only let me pass through on foot. Just as the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, and the Moabites who live in Ar did for me, until I crossed over the Jordan, until I will cross over to the Jordan, into the land which the Lord your God is giving me. So what he says to Sihon is, I'm not going to come in and attack you. All right? Let me pass through. Verse 30. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through the land. For the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate in order to deliver him into your hand as he is today. And then he goes on and he says, and the Lord said to me, see, I've begun to deliver Sihon in his hand over to you. Begin to occupy that you may possess his land. Now, you should ask yourself, why? Why has he passed through all this other territory and forbidden them to make war? And now he gets up to Sihon and even further up to the land of Og, which you're going to see in a minute. And he says to them, make war.
Leaders?
Well, let me say it again, Jack, because there's giants there.
Well, I was saying
Okay?
meaning giants.
Yes. Now, so let's summarize. Okay? Let me summarize this for you. Number one, the Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites will be left alone as this territory was given to Lot and his grandson. Right? Number two, in years prior, these three groups had to displace the giant tribes, the Emim and the Zamzummim, which are linked to the Anakim, which are all biologically related to this greater giant group or pool, genetic pool called the Raphaim. Number three, the Lord tells them to seek travel permission through these territories, which was originally granted until they approached the territory of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, who refused their request. Now, I want you to learn something interesting about Sihon of Heshbon, okay? And that is turn to the book of Amos. You're going to have to go to the, quote, minor prophets, past Daniel, to Amos. Amos tells us a very interesting thing. It's chapter 2, and it's going to be verses 9 and 10. Starting verse 9 of chapter 2. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite. Amorite is a term that's used in the Bible for all the peoples in the territory. They're all together called the Ammonites. It's a group terminology. It's Amorites, correct. The Amorites. So he says, yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them. Now just look at the description of some of the Amorite. Though his height was like the height of cedars, and he was strong as the oaks, I even destroyed his fruit above and his root below. In other words, he's saying of Sihon that Sihon was also a giant. Okay? Also a giant. Now, so the territory the Israelites are approaching was particularly sinister and was a satanic stronghold. That's what we need to keep in mind as to why God did this. Now, Sihon had a fellow Amorite king that was allied to him next door in his territory, and his name was Og. You were in Deuteronomy 2, go to Deuteronomy 3. Og's an interesting guy. You wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley. Okay?
See the one that had 6 toes and...
So, let me try to read this quickly, because it's just going to tell you something about Og in this area, okay? Verse 1, Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, with all his people came out to meet us in the battle of Edrei. But the Lord said to me, Don't fear him, for I have delivered him and all his people into this land, into your hand. And you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, there who lived in Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered Og, also king of Bashan, with all his people into our hand, and we smote them until no survivor was left. And it talks about, and it goes on, and I'm not going to read the rest of it until I want you to see verse 11. Okay? Here's an interesting fact about Og. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Raphaim. Behold, his bedstand was an iron bedstand, and it's in Ribah of the sons of Ammon. In other words, at the time of this writing, it was kept in Ammon, in the city of Rabbah, okay? Like a collector's piece. Its length was 9 cubits. That would be about 13 and a half feet. And its width was 4 cubits, which would be about 6 feet. Now, that means, I would say conservatively, Og was certainly 12 feet tall. He was a big giant. Now, there's a very interesting tradition about Og that you find that is in Jewish literature. Can you turn further? And I want to show you. Okay. Now, here's the area of where Og was. And this is a picture. Okay? This is called the legendary land of Argob, which was a biblical land filled with the Nephilim descendants, okay? Here's Edrei, which was the capital of Og, where they had this battle, where they defeated Og, okay? Here is another capital of Og's, and here is this interesting place called Gilgal-Raphaim. And today, you can go to Gilgal-Raphaim, okay? This is Gilgal-Raphaim. And in the very center, there were a lot of these were dolmens. Dolmens are 3-sided structures, 2 large stones with a capstone on the top. And it's where they buried spiritually important people, okay? They're huge. They're huge. This looks, you don't understand how big this is from the picture, okay? Maybe we have another picture of it to show you the perspective. But in the center of it, there was a huge dolmen existed. And this was called the dolmen of Og, because Jewish tradition and literature says that that's where Og's body was buried, right there. Give me another picture of, keep going. We have another one I thought we had of, that's the only ones we had, okay. There was another one I was going to show you a picture of a dolmen. At any rate, would be today in the Golan Heights of Israel. That's where it's centered. It's just inside, technically, the border of Syria now. And it still exists. Of course, it's broken down. But of course, as you can see, it is a wheel. It was a massive calendar, like all of the megaliths or calendars that predicted the seasons, and it was used by for occultic purposes. That was its purpose. So, last thing here, and we'll finish up. This territory, of course, that he reigns over is Ashtaroth and Edrei, these 2 major towns. And of course, in Joshua 12:4 and 5, we see this is the area of Bashan. Now, Bashan, technically in Hebrew, is actually pronounced Batan, or if we put vowels in it, we would call it Bathan. And its translation means the serpent. Oh, yes. Thus, Og is the king of the land of the serpent. That would be, in Hebrew, what it would mean. So who do you think set up Og there? The serpent, the Nakash. Now, it's also interesting that in Joshua 12:5, Og's territory, we're not going to turn there tonight, but you can look at it if you want to in Joshua 12:5. Og's territory includes Mount Hermon. Okay? Which is an interesting connection, isn't it? Now,
what happened in Mount Hermon?
That is where, according to First Enoch, the 200 fallen Elohim came down to earth and started the problem in Genesis 6. Now, one last connection and we'll stop. The word Hermon in Hebrew is actually Kermon. We would pronounce it or spell it K-H-E-R-M-O-N. It has the same verb root in Hebrew as another interesting word that's used over and over and over again in the book of Joshua. And that word is karam, K-H-A-R-A-M, which means to be devoted to destruction. It is the word God used over and over again in the conquest when he said, "This is my holy war." Remember, we read the book of Joshua over and over again. He says, they're devoted to destruction. Put them under the ban. They're devoted to destruction. That's the word he uses. But it's an offshoot in the verbiage of actually Mount Hermon. Same root. Therefore, it ties together part of God's reason for the annihilation of these peoples in the conquest, because they're infiltrated with all of these beings that were seated there by the 200 Elohim that came down and created these hybrids. And God says to Satan, you place them there, you're trying to block me from my promise to Abraham from the land, and it ain't going to happen. So at the conquest, he sends Israel in and says, all of these peoples that are these giant tribes, annihilate them. You notice how over and over again we talk about Joshua. Annihilate them. Don't leave a one of them left.
God's angels were fighting with Joshua's army because Joshua would not be able to.
They were miraculously capable of killing all of these giant peoples. Jack.
In those cities then where the Lord told him to destroy everything there, possibly, and even the animals, that they actually, the animals may have been
Hybrid.
by
It could be.
satanic,
Yes.
everything down.
Yes. Because he wants the land cleaned out from the satanic hybridization that's occurred there. Okay? So again, back to my point. If you don't understand the story of Genesis 6, how will you understand what they're doing in the conquest?
And what for?
How will you understand the meaning of all these names and the connections of these Hebrew words? It brings you all back to, this is the seed of the serpent. These are the seed of the serpent. Okay?
And they're in the land, and they have to clear it.
Yep. So next week, we'll look more carefully, more closely into what happened during the conquest. And we're going to be taking a further look at Mount Hermon, because it's a theme that actually ends up, interestingly, going all the way to the day of Jesus. We'll eventually make that connection. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Michael, close us with a word of prayer.
Father, we thank you for the lesson that we've listened to this evening and to the scriptural substantiation of the words and the teaching that Tim has brought forth tonight. God, I pray you'd help us each and every one, Lord, to take it in, to consider it, to understand it in a better way, Lord, as we move along in the future studies. Just go with us each one here this evening. Help us, Lord, that as we understand these things, Lord, that we'd be able to get a view of what it is you have for us in our lives and in our futures. And Father, we'll thank you for everything you do. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.